A dark shadow swept across the known world. Nothing would ever be the same again. The ship left Caffa in the autumn of 1347. It was loaded with silk, spices, and fur, the most valuable cargo in the known world. The captain had one job: get it to Messina. Every day at sea was money. Every delay was loss. The winds were good. The route was clear. Nobody checked what else was on board. When the ship docked in Sicily, the harbor master walked up the gangplank. He turned around almost immediately. He had seen enough. The sailors were either dead or dying. Black swellings the size of eggs erupting from their armpits and groins. Some were delirious. Some were already cold. The harbor master ordered the ships out of the port. But too late. Within weeks, Messina was burning its dead. Within months, the disease had reached mainland Italy. Within 2 years, it had crossed the Alps, entered France, crossed the English Channel, and pushed north into Scandinavia. Here is what nobody understood in 1347, and what historians are still reckoning with today. The plague did not travel in spite of Europe's greatest achievement. It traveled because of it. To understand what happened, you need to understand the world that existed before the plague arrived, because it was, by the standards of the medieval period, an extraordinarily successful world. The mid-14th century was the peak of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. For roughly a century, the Mongol Empire had controlled a continuous landmass stretching from China to the Black Sea. And whatever else you say about the Mongols, they kept the roads open. Merchants could travel from Venice to Beijing, not comfortably, not quickly, but reliably. For the first time in centuries, the Silk Road was a functioning commercial artery. Goods moved east to west. Silk, porcelain, gunpowder, paper. Goods moved west to east. Wool, silver, glass. The Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, had built their entire economies around this system. They planted trading colonies at key choke points along the route. Their agents haggled in Constantinople. Their most ambitious merchants pushed all the way to the Crimean Peninsula, to a fortified port city called Caffa. Caffa was the edge of the known world for European commerce. Beyond it lay the Mongol steppe. But from Caffa, a merchant with enough nerve could source goods from China, Persia, India, and ship them west to European markets that would pay extraordinary prices for the exotic and the rare. A Florentine merchant named Francesco Balducci Pagolotti captured this world in his trade manual, written around 1340. The road to China, he wrote, is perfectly safe, whether by day or by night. He listed tariffs, exchange rates, the best interpreters to hire, the camel costs per load. A handbook for a system that worked. What Pagolotti could not have known was that the system's greatest strength, its reach, its speed, its connectivity, had quietly become its greatest vulnerability. The more nodes the network had, the faster anything could move through it, including things nobody intended to send. The plague almost certainly began somewhere in Central Asia, the Tan Shan Mountains, the steppes near Kyrgyzstan, a reservoir of infection that had simmered in rodent populations for centuries. What is not debated is how it moved. It followed the trade routes. It reached the trading cities of Central Asia by the early 1340s. Caravans carried it west along the Silk, rode to Samarkand, to Astrakhan, to the northern shore of the Black Sea. Each stop was a node. Each node was a market. Each market was a crowd. The disease moved at the speed of commerce. Caffa is where the story shifts. In 1346, the Mongol Khan Janib besieged the city, a trade dispute that had turned violent. His army camped outside the walls. Then his soldiers started dying, not from arrows or starvation, but from sudden swellings and fever. Janib ordered his engineers to load the dead bodies into catapults and hurl them over the walls. The first biological weapon in recorded history was delivered by trebuchet. Inside the walls, the Genoese merchants watched the bodies land. They dragged them to the sea and threw them in. But it was already too late. Whatever was in those bodies, the fleas, the bacteria, the invisible enemy, was now inside the city. A lawyer named Gabriele de Mussi was in Caffa when this happened. He watched the siege. He watched the dead arrive. He watched his colleagues begin to die in ways he had never seen before. He recorded everything, not as a scientist, but as a man trying to make sense of the inexplicable. "We Genoese and Venetians," he wrote, "carried the disease to our own cities and corrupted our neighbors." He knew, he understood, in some partial way, that the merchants themselves were the vector. That the same ships that carried silk and spices west were now carrying something else. But here is the thing about de Mussi. He got on a ship anyway. Not because he was reckless, not because he didn't care, but because the entire logic of the world he lived in was built around one principle: goods must move, ships must sail, the network must function. Commerce did not pause for illness. It never had. The fleet left Caffa in 1347. Multiple ships, multiple crews, all of them already exposed. They stopped at Constantinople. They stopped at Messina. They stopped at Sardinia, at Marseille, at Genoa itself. At every port, they left something behind. A Genoese merchant watching those ships leave Caffa harbor would have thought he was witnessing a commercial retreat, a temporary setback in a bad year. He would not have understood that he was watching the most efficient delivery system in medieval history begin its most consequential shipment. He was not escaping. He was the delivery. Here is the question that nobody in 1347 could answer, and that nobody in power wanted to ask. If the very system that built your wealth is now killing your people, what do you do? Do you shut down the ports? Burn the ships? Close the trade routes that feed your city? Or do you keep them open and hope the disease passes? The rulers of medieval Europe faced this exact choice, and almost all of them chose wrong. But the reason they chose wrong is not what you think. Let's stay with Gabriele de Mussi for a moment. He was not a merchant. He was a notary, a legal professional, trained to observe and record. When he wrote about the siege of Caffa, he was trying to create a historical document. He wanted people to understand what had happened. De Mussi was a man caught between two realities. He could see, with his own eyes, that the ships were spreading the disease. He had watched people die. He had written it down. And yet, he was also a product of a commercial civilization that had spent 2 centuries building the idea that movement was progress. That connection was prosperity. Picture him on the dock at Caffa. The harbor is half empty. Some ships are already gone. The bodies have been cleared from the streets, but the smell hasn't. He is holding his manuscripts, his records, his evidence, deciding whether to board. Every individual actor in the network had a rational reason to keep moving. The merchant had goods to sell. The captain had contracts to fulfill. The harbor official had taxes to collect. The city council had guilds to placate and debts to service. No one had the incentive to be the person who stopped the system. In the markets that were still open, men were selling grain next to streets where houses had been nailed shut. Commerce and catastrophe, side by side. Nobody giving the order to stop. De Mussi wrote something that captures the whole disaster in a single line. Alas, we brought the evil home with us. not an accusation, a confession. He understood, looking back, that the system had failed. But the failure was not visible until it was irreversible. This is the collapse pattern in its purest form. Not a villain, not a single catastrophic decision, just a system, optimized over decades for one purpose, producing an outcome that no one designed and no one could stop. The plague reached Messina in October 1347. By January 1348, it was in Genoa, Venice, and Marseille simultaneously. 3 different cities, on 3 different coastlines, infected through 3 separate shipping lanes. This is when the authorities finally acted. Venice issued the first quarantine orders in history. Ships arriving from infected areas would be held offshore for 30 days, later extended to 40. Quarantina in Italian. That is where we get the word quarantine. Inspectors were appointed. Penalties were severe. It was intelligent. It was organized. It was too late. Imagine the harbor at Venice in early 1348. Ships anchored offshore, their crews visible on deck, waving at the city they cannot enter. On the docks, merchants arguing with inspectors. Somewhere inside the city, in a house on a canal, a family is already sick. They arrived last week, before the order. By the time Venice imposed quarantine, the disease was already in Venice. The network had already delivered it. The quarantine was not a prevention. It was a door being closed after the house had burned. And now, here is where the collapse pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every attempt to stop the plague used the same infrastructure that had spread it. Venice's quarantine enforcement required ships to patrol the harbor, to inspect incoming vessels, to transport officials. Those ships used the same ports, the same routes, the same labor pools as the trading vessels. Cities that closed their gates found the disease was already inside. Cities that burned the belongings of the dead found the fire spread faster than the plague. Noble families that fled to the countryside, taking their servants and their goods, carried the infection into villages that might otherwise have been spared. In Paris, the dead carts moved through the streets before dawn, when fewer people would see them. The drivers wore masks soaked in vinegar. They had learned by then not to touch the bodies with bare hands. It didn't help. Most of them were dead within weeks. Here is what Florence looked like in the summer of 1348. Church bells had been ringing for so long that the city council ordered them silenced, because the sound of constant death was destroying what remained of public morale. Priests who had given last rites to hundreds were now refusing to enter houses. Some fled their own parishes. Bodies were left in doorways because families could not find anyone to carry them. Dogs were found eating the dead in the street. A notary arrived to record a will and found everyone in the house already dead. He recorded that in his notes, then went to the next address. That notary kept working, because what else do you do when the world stops making sense? You do the next thing. You go to the next address. Running was rational. Staying was rational. Burning was rational. Every single response was rational from the perspective of the individual making it. Collectively, they made everything worse. This is the collapse pattern. Not ignorance. Not stupidity. A system that had been optimized for connection could not be selectively closed. You could not keep the silk moving and stop the disease. The network carried everything to everyone at the same speed. De Mussi understood this in his bones as he watched the harbor at Caffa disappear behind him. What could have been different? Timeline 1. Early closure. If the Italian city-states had responded when reports of the plague began, emerging from Central Asia in the early 1340s, closing the Black Sea trading routes, quarantining Caffa before the siege, the arithmetic of contagion would have looked very different. The plague might have remained a regional catastrophe, devastating Central Asia, but contained by distance. But this would have required the Italian merchant class to voluntarily destroy the system that had made them the wealthiest people in Europe. It would have required Genoa and Venice to cooperate rather than compete. It would have required institutions that didn't exist to make decisions that no one had authority to make. The micro-reality of this path, Pegolotti's trade manual, gathering dust, the colony at Caffa, abandoned, the spice markets of Venice, silent, and roughly 25 million Europeans who died between 1347 and 1351, alive. Entire family lines that were erased, continuing. Children born who were never born. Timeline 2, one captain. What if just one captain in 1347 had made a different choice? What if the commander of one Caffa ship, watching his crew sicken, understanding what the bodies over the wall had meant, had ordered his vessel to anchor offshore and wait? He would have been ruined. His cargo would have rotted. His investors would have pursued him in every court in Genoa. But the disease would not have reached Messina on his ship. Would it have arrived on another? Almost certainly. But every break in the chain changes the arithmetic of a pandemic. One man's financial ruin against 25 million lives. He never got to make that trade. He didn't know it was on the table. Here is the reversal that makes people uncomfortable. The plague did not slow Europe's development, it accelerated it. When a third of the population died, labor became scarce. Scarce labor has value. Serfs who had been legally bound to the land found that lords suddenly needed them more than they needed the lords. Wages rose. Feudalism, stable for centuries, began to fracture. The church, which had promised that faith would protect the faithful, watched as faith offered no protection whatsoever. Its authority never fully recovered. And the Italian merchants who survived, in cities that had lost half their populations, were surrounded by inherited wealth with fewer heirs to claim it. Capital concentrated. Investment increased. The same trade network that delivered the plague began, within a generation, to fund the Renaissance. The system that killed them built the world their grandchildren would inherit. It did not collapse. It mutated. Gabriele de Mussi made it home to Piacenza. He survived the plague that he had partly helped carry west. He continued writing. His account of the siege of Caffa is one of the most important primary sources we have for how the Black Death began. He spent the rest of his life as a notary, recording contracts, witnessing transactions, maintaining the legal infrastructure of a commercial society. The same society whose networks had devastated Europe. There is something almost unbearable about that. A man who understood what had happened, who wrote it down, who said, "We brought the evil home with us," and then went back to work inside the system. But what else could he do? The system was not optional. It was the world. This is what the Black Death actually teaches us. Not about medicine. Not about medieval superstition. It teaches us about the cost of building a system so large, so efficient, so deeply embedded in everything, that no single person can pause it. No single decision can stop it. It runs because it runs. It carries what it carries. The Silk Road was a miracle. It connected civilizations. It moved ideas and goods across distances that had previously been impossible. It made Europe richer than it had ever been. And one autumn, it carried something it didn't know it was carrying, and delivered it perfectly. A system that cannot be questioned becomes a prison. The ships that left Caffa in 1347 are still sailing. The system they built, the principle that networks must grow, that goods must move, that connection is always progress, is more deeply embedded now than anything the Genoese merchants could have imagined. The question Caffa asked in 1347 has never been answered. We just keep building faster ships. History has patterns, and we just decoded it. This was Historithm. See you in the next video.